Have you ever heard strange knocks coming from the walls, or seen objects move by themselves? The Andover Poltergeist case is one of the most well-documented and puzzling paranormal events ever recorded. Get ready to learn about the frightening story of a regular family whose lives were turned upside down by an invisible force that they named Eric. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. Even though it might not be well known outside of paranormal circles, the Andover Poltergeist case is one of the most interesting and believable ever recorded. What makes it special is that the investigation happened while the strange events were at their peak. Because of this, the incidents are some of the most detailed ever documented and were seen by many people regularly. The poltergeist encounters in Andover, Hampshire are part of a group of cases that have helped researchers find patterns and similarities. One of the most fascinating and important parts of the poltergeist activity is the loud knocks, which seem to be a way for the entity, or whatever it is, to communicate. Scientists have also studied these strange happenings. Paranormal investigator Barry Colvin studied the case through 9 visits to the house and interviews with the family from late April to mid-June of 1974. At first, the family wanted to keep their story and report private. However, over 30 years later, with everyone involved having moved away and using fake names, the story was shared in the late 2000s. The following account is based on this investigation. The strange events started suddenly in April of 1974. The 8 members of the Andrews family had lived in their council house in Andover, Hampshire in England for 5 years without any problems. Also, the house was only a little over 10 years old. It was built in the local council in the early 1960s to provide housing for people working in London, so it didn't have a long, old, mysterious history. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews lived in the house with their 6 children: Maria, who was 20, Teresa, who was 12, Kevin, who was 19, Gary, who was 17, Stephen, who was 15, and their youngest was Mark, who was 10 years old. When Colvin first met the family on April 28th, the strange events, well, they were witnessed by the entire family and other people. These events had been happening over a 2-week period at that point. At the first meeting, Teresa and Maria reported that they were the first to notice strange tapping sounds while they were in bed on Good Friday, which was the 12th of April. At first, they thought these sounds were coming from another bedroom, maybe made by one of their siblings, as the noises seemed to come from a shared wall. However, when Teresa started asking questions using a method where 1 knock meant yes and 2 knocks meant no, and speaking so quietly that Maria could barely hear her, let alone anyone else on the other side of the wall, well, she started to receive correct answers to her questions. These events would continue on every night, with the 2 girls keeping the mystery communication to themselves, finding it quite entertaining. Eventually though, they told the rest of the family about these mysterious knocks, and the fact that it answered all of their questions. The rest of the Andrews family not only heard the knocks for themselves, but also began asking this mysterious presence other questions. By this time, the communication had become far more advanced. Initially, the questions were limited to yes or no answers, with 3 knocks then indicating that the entity didn't even know the answer to the question. However, the family soon developed a more complex method of communication, where the entity would knock a certain number of times to represent a letter in the alphabet. So 1 knock for A, 2 for B, and so on and so forth, allowing it to spell out answers. Teresa and Maria kept talking to the mysterious presence behind the tapping sounds. They found out that the presence was called Eric Waters, based on the answers that they received. Eric didn't just answer questions about who he was, he also gave Mr. Andrews advice on horse racing. He correctly predicted that Liverpool would win the FA Cup and that Leeds United would win the league. Even although the questions were still fun, like guessing who would win at an upcoming football game, the strange, smart knocks made Mr. and Mrs. Andrews feel a bit uneasy. They also saw that the knocks and answers almost never happened unless Teresa was sitting on or lying on her bed. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews asked different people to help them understand this knocking phenomenon, like the police, their local priest, and a medium from a nearby spiritualist church. What the medium said really worried Mr. and Mrs. Andrews the most. She told them that Eric was the ghost of a small boy buried under the floorboards of their house, and that he wanted to take over the personality of Teresa. As time went by, things started to get a little bit more sinister. The following evening, at around 8:15 PM on April 29th, Colvin got a phone call from Mr. Andrews. From the way that Mr. Andrews was speaking, Calvin could tell that something bad had happened. Mr. Andrews told him that Eric had kept the family up all night with really loud knocking and banging noises. They tried asking Eric to stop, but he refused. Mr. Andrews believed that Eric was trying to frighten them on purpose. Colvin returned to the Andrews home the following day. Just as he thought, the parents seemed exhausted and concerned. They described what had occurred the previous night. Since the odd activity appeared to begin when Teresa went to bed, they decided that Colvin would return later that evening to witness this firsthand. So he did around 8:30 PM when Teresa was getting ready to go to bed. When Colvin arrived, he could sense that the mood in the house was tense and uncomfortable. He spent around an hour with the parents, listening to Teresa and Maria trying to communicate with Eric upstairs. Then they heard some soft knocking sounds that they had heard before. Mr. Andrews went upstairs to talk to the girls and ask Eric questions. Apart from one loud noise, most of the tapping sounded fairly playful, just like it had on the earlier nights. After some time, Mr. Andrews spoke with Colvin. He observed that the tapping often stopped when someone new entered the room. Mr. Andrews suggested that Colvin go upstairs quietly and stand outside the girls' room to see what happened. Colvin followed his instructions and stopped near the doorway to the room. He couldn't hear the questions or tapping from there, but he could see that no one in the room was making the sounds. He moved closer to the doorway until he was practically inside the room. When Mr. Andrews saw him, he asked if it was okay for Colvin to come into the room. The response was clear, a loud bang, indicating yes. Once he was permitted entry into the room, the investigator entered the room and stood near Teresa's bed. He noticed that the knocking sounds seemed to be coming from the centre of the wall opposite the girls' beds. He also observed that when Eric answered questions, especially the ones where he used numbers to represent letters of the alphabet, the last knock was always the loudest, indicating that it was the final one. At one point, while Eric was answering these questions, Colvin leaned over and put his hands on the wall. He was surprised to feel that the wall was vibrating with each knock. After around another 15 minutes, Mrs. Andrews decided that it was time to stop communicating for the night and said goodnight to Eric. In response, there was a very soft but clear single knock. The adults then went downstairs and Mr. Andrews asked Colvin directly what he thought was happening. So Colvin began discussing poltergeist activity with them. He explained that he didn't believe the entity causing the knocks was actually a boy named Eric, but rather it was probably due to some unknown energy related to the specific psychological dynamics inside that house. Even although the Andrews family didn't know much about poltergeist stuff back then, they were interested in what Colvin had to say. They even agreed with his suggestion to move the knocking sounds away from the wall and to somewhere else in the room or even elsewhere in the house. This way, they hoped to make sure the knocks weren't someone playing a prank, maybe from next door, like what happened in other cases. When Colvin left later that evening, they decided to meet again soon and carry out their plans to try and figure out what was causing these strange events. Colvin ended up going back to the Andrews home 2 days later on the afternoon of the 2nd of May and started explaining his plans to continue on with this investigation. This included trying to move the tapping away from that wall connected to the neighbouring property. Colvin also noticed some more details, like how Eric's replies seemed clearer when Mrs. Andrews asked questions. Because of this, he suggested that she could be the one to communicate with Eric during these tests. One of the most important questions was for Eric to communicate with her in another part of the room. The group waited patiently for around 20 minutes before Teresa said that Eric was no longer there. But as soon as she suggested trying again later, there was a loud double knock from the wall. Mrs. Andrews asked if Eric was there, and there was another clear knock from the same wall. They asked several more questions, all answered with the usual knocking. Then Mrs. Andrews asked Eric if he would knock on the headboard of the bed. He said he would, and when she asked again, there was a faint tap from the headboard. Colvin placed his hand on the headboard of the bed as Mrs. Andrews asked once more if Eric would knock on it, and he did, but it was louder this time, and Colvin could clearly feel the vibration. They repeated this test several more times, each knocking getting louder. Emboldened by Eric's ability to knock on the headboard, they decided to push the boundaries a little bit further and test his limits. Mrs. Andrews, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation, asked Eric if he could knock on the metal part of the bed frame. To their utter astonishment, Eric obliged, producing a knock that resonated throughout the room. Colvin, ever the keen observer, well, he noted that the sound was markedly different from the knocks on the wall and the headboard, possessing a much higher pitch that seemed to hang in the air. But again, this could just be down to the fact that it was a metal bed frame. The group continued their impromptu experiments for around 20 minutes longer, each new request met with a corresponding knock from Eric. However, as time wore on, they began to notice that the knocks were growing fainter, as if Eric's energy was slowly being drained. Mrs. Andrews, glancing at her daughter with concern, mentioned that Teresa also looked pretty exhausted, a state that she had been in for about a week due to her lack of sleep during this strange ordeal. As Colvin left the Andrews home that night, his mind was buzzing with implications of what he had just witnessed. The experiments had only served to strengthen his belief that this was indeed a genuine poltergeist case. He knew that he needed time to process his notes and gather his thoughts, but little did he know that he would be drawn back into this mystery just 3 days later. On the evening of May 4th, Colvin received an urgent telephone call from Mr. Andrews. The man's voice was strained as he recounted a particularly intense session with Eric, one that had left the entire family shaken. Eric, it seemed, had grown pretty angry and frustrated, his emotions manifesting in the form of thunderous knocks that reverberated throughout the entire house. The sounds were so powerful that they drew the attention of neighbours and passers-by, who stopped outside the house wondering what on earth could be causing such a commotion inside. The following day, Colvin wasted no time in visiting the Andrews home. Mrs. Andrews eagerly shared the latest developments from their recent communications with Eric, this mysterious presence that inhabited their house. According to Eric's messages, his skeletal remains were hidden beneath the floorboards, and he desperately desired a proper burial. But the story took an even more bizarre twist when Kevin, feeling bold, attempted to communicate directly with Eric. As soon as Kevin began asking questions, the knocking abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Undeterred though, Kevin tried posing several more inquiries, but each one was met with a deafening absence of any response. In a clever move, Kevin decided to employ a bit of reverse psychology. With a mischievous grin, he declared loudly, "I don't believe that Eric ever existed." Suddenly, a single thunderous bang reverted throughout the entire house, as if Eric was really angry at the mere suggestion of his non-existence. Kevin, now fully committed to his taunting strategy, continued to provoke Eric, claiming that he doubted Eric was ever a real person at all. Once again, a single solitary forceful bang echoed throughout the entire place. Pushing further, Kevin boldly stated, "I think that Eric is nothing but a liar." A tense moment of silence followed before a series of powerful, rapid-fire, thunderous bangs erupted one after another, like the furious pounding of an agitated spirit. It seemed that Kevin's words had struck a nerve, and Eric was now really angry. After a much-needed break of about an hour, the knocking started again, carrying on until the early hours in the morning. Even though Eric seemed upset during this entire time, he did manage to answer some of the family's questions, providing a small glimmer of hope in the midst of this chaos. As the sun began to rise, the sounds finally came to a stop, leaving behind a strange silence. The Andrews family felt completely drained, both in mind and in body, after a long, tiring night. Mrs. Andrews, at her wits' end, shared the troubling events with the investigator. With a desperate plea, she asked Colvin if he could find someone who could come and help them to get rid of Eric's presence altogether, longing for the return of just a peaceful, simple family life. As Colvin engaged in conversation with the Andrews family, Teresa and Kevin seized the opportunity to attempt further communications with Eric. Initially, their efforts were met with silence, the room void of any response. However, Kevin, Again, feeling a bit mischievous, well, he began to taunt Eric, accusing him of being a liar again. Almost immediately, a resounding knock echoed throughout the room, causing the adults to rush up to the bedroom to investigate. Kevin, undeterred by the sudden response, continued his playful teasing of Eric. His words seemed to provoke a reaction as a series of powerful, intense knocks followed shortly thereafter. The sheer force and intensity of these knocks left Mrs. Andrews so frightened that she felt compelled to leave the room, seeking solace from the unsettling atmosphere. Colvin, intrigued by the commotion, approached the bed and quickly realised that the source of the knocking seemed to be emanating from the headboard itself. Curious, he reached out and placed his hand on the wooden frame. To his surprise, he could physically feel the vibrations coursing through the headboard with each knock, confirming that the strange occurrences were indeed happening right before his very eyes. So, for a period of a few weeks, life in the Andrews household seemed to return to a state of relative calm. However, whenever Kevin took it upon himself to intentionally provoke Eric with his teasing, the paranormal activity would ramp up and intensify, as if Eric was responding to the taunts with heightened energy. The family also began to notice a peculiar connection between Teresa and Eric, almost as if they were engaging in a form of telepathic communication. Teresa would think of a number, and when she asked Eric to confirm it, he would respond with the exact number of knocks, displaying an uncanny accuracy that defied any normal explanation. Upon learning of this strange phenomenon, Colvin's curiosity was piqued, and he felt compelled to put this alleged mind-reading ability to the test. On the afternoon of May 23rd, Colvin arrived at the Andrews home, armed with a plan to conduct an experiment with Eric. He had brought along a set of 40 cards, consisting of 4 sets of numbers ranging from 1 to 10. With Teresa situated on her bed, the usual spot for her communications with Eric, Colvin began the experiment. He randomly selected a card from the deck and swiftly revealed it to everyone in the room, taking care not to verbalise the number aloud. He then held the card facing the wall, ensuring that no one could inadvertently glimpse the number. With a clear voice, Colvin asked Eric to identify the number on the card. As fate would have it, the card Colvin had chosen was a number 4. Without hesitation, Eric responded with 4 crisp, distinct knocks, sending a chill down the spines of all those present in the room. Even though Eric got almost all of the questions right, he missed 4 out of 27. Still, the experiment was a big success. The high accuracy made Colvin certain that the knocking sounds couldn't have been made by someone on the other side of the bedroom wall. After these tests, the family asked Eric many questions about himself and his family. While he answered most of them, he knocked 3 times on some questions, which meant that he just didn't know the answer. One of the most interesting questions came from Colvin, who asked if he could capture Eric on camera. Eric responded with a yes, and they decided to try it during the next visit. Colvin returned on June 7th, bringing with him Dr. Reinhard Schuffer, a senior scientist from the Egham Research Laboratories. Their goal was to capture an image of Eric. They set up the necessary equipment while the family and investigators gathered in the bedroom. Communications had started, and it was mostly friendly. An interesting moment though was when Eric replied no to the question of whether or not Teresa needed to be in the room for him to communicate. As they tried to take photographs, they asked Eric where they could position the camera to capture his image. While they were at it, Colvin had a sudden thought. Could Eric see what they were doing? Almost immediately, a single knock signalled yes, and it echoed through the room. Bearing in mind that Colvin never actually verbalised this question. During the session, Eric was completely cooperative and suggested aiming the camera at the wall just above the headboard of the bed. But despite their efforts, the photos didn't reveal any figure or presence. However, they did capture a full sentence spoken by Eric, seemingly unprompted. He said,
"I'm here to rest and stop my bones from rotting."
Colvin noticed something strange about Eric. It was like he could read Mrs. Andrews' mind. Whenever she was about to ask him something, Eric seemed to already know the question, just like he knew when she wondered if he could see her. 3 days later, on June 10th, Colvin returned to the Andrews house for the last time. By then, Eric was acting differently. Sometimes he didn't respond at all. When Colvin arrived about 7:30 p.m. that night, the family asked him many questions, but Eric still stayed silent. Suddenly, Teresa said, "Eric is gone, and he's gone forever." She couldn't explain why or how she knew this, She just said that she felt it deep inside. Colvin first met the Andrews family after reading about their experiences in a local newspaper. He noticed that they were reluctant to share details with him at first. He figured that they might not understand why he was so interested in their story. Plus, the family wanted to keep the investigation private and not make it public. This made Colvin think their story was genuine. After all, I mean, if they were after money or fame, well, they would have been keen to share everything and push for his findings to be published. Colvin also noted that, despite everything, the family seemed relatively happy. The strange incidents, though interesting at first, well, they were not welcome in their usually peaceful home. After all the encounters, and with Eric now gone, Colvin was convinced that the family hadn't made up strange happenings. When asked if they thought Eric was a person buried under the property, they generally believed that he was, and that his remains might eventually be found under there. Colvin, however, he had a different idea. He suggested that there probably weren't any remains under the Andrews house. Instead, he thought that Eric wasn't a ghost, or even a person who had once actually lived. He believed that Eric was more likely some strange and unknown form of energy. After the Andover incident, Colvin tried to find out if Eric Waters had any connections to the area. He even talked to a local historian. Despite Waters being a common name in the area at that time, they couldn't find any records of an Eric Waters dating back to the late 17th century. One interesting lead, though, came from Mr. Smallbones, the former owner of that land. He said that from the end of World War II up until round about 1960, the land was a caravan site that attracted many from the travelling community. If Eric Waters was part of that community, it could explain why there were no official records. However, there was no evidence that anything bad happened on that land during that time. Colvin also discovered a grim piece of history, a murder around 1890 at Drunken Tree Drove, not far from the Andrews property. The victim was hanged from a tree, but no name was ever recorded in any reports. Since this person was hanged, it's likely that their remains were buried in a proper graveyard, not on some remote patch of land somewhere that houses would eventually be built on. So while the murder did happen, it's almost certain that the victim wasn't Eric Waters. So there are two other possibilities, though they seem unlikely. According to the local register of births and deaths from 1837, 2 children were registered to parents named Waters. Mr. and Mrs. A. Waters back in 1878 and Mr. and Mrs. S. Waters in 1897. However, the children's first names were never recorded. While it's possible that one of these children could be the Eric Waters who communicated with the Andrews family, it didn't seem very likely. Colvin came to the same conclusion. Like in other similar cases, this poltergeist activity at the Andrews home was significant because it gave scientific insight into the mysterious knocks often heard in such cases. We've talked about these knocks before, but it's still worth revisiting them. Instead of the sounds coming from something hitting an object like a wall, the knocks seem to come from inside the object itself, as if some kind of energy was inside producing these sounds. This doesn't explain exactly how the sounds occur or what causes these eerie knocks, but it shows they are much more complex and mysterious than just a physical impact. As we've discussed before on this channel, poltergeist activity often happens around kids and teenagers. In Eric's case, he communicated with many people, but he liked talking to Mrs. Andrews the most. Strange things seem to happen more around young Teresa. This doesn't mean Teresa or the other kids were lying or playing tricks. Some experts believe that the energy from these kids somehow makes these weird things happen. This energy isn't like a ghost or a spirit, it's more like thoughts from their own minds, especially Teresa's. Colvin explained that Eric couldn't remember much about his own past because he was essentially part of Teresa's subconscious imagination. This likely means that Teresa didn't even realise this either, or she might have created a detailed backstory for Eric, as seen in other fake cases. Colvin called this suppressed tension and suggested that a thorough psychological test could help determine if this tension is linked to poltergeist activity. If this connection is proven, it would not only explain some poltergeist phenomena, providing relief for many who have experienced such events, but also highlight the incredible power of the human mind. It gets even more intriguing when Eric seems to know what Teresa is thinking, or answers Mrs. Andrews' questions before she finishes even asking them. Colvin was surprised when he listened back to the recordings of the numbered card test and realised that Eric's answers were actually all correct, even though they initially seemed wrong because he answered too quickly. This happened because Eric responded before Mrs. Andrews finished speaking, so the first knocks were always missed. Some might think Teresa peeked at the cards and then pretended Eric was answering telepathically, but that doesn't explain how she made the knocks happen in the first place. Sure, there's been cases in the past where these phantom knocks have, it's been discovered that it was someone clicking their toes or using another device to fake this poltergeist activity. The Andover Poltergeist case is unique, but it's not the only one. Similar occurrences have been reported in different places all across the world for many years. This would suggest that whatever causes these spooky events is real, even if we don't fully understand it yet. Maybe the truth isn't about ghosts and monsters, but something related to quantum physics, like energy manifesting in unusual ways or different dimensions intersecting with each other. The Andover Poltergeist case stands as a reminder that the universe still holds profound mysteries that we don't yet understand. While skeptics might dismiss these stories as just made up, the large amount of supporting evidence and the consistent reports of similar events across different cultures and times, that can't be ignored. As our specific knowledge grows, we might one day figure out the mysterious forces behind poltergeist activity. Until then, cases like the Andover haunting remind us that there are still unknown realms waiting to be explored with open minds and a sense of curiosity. So, that's it for another video, folks. Thanks ever so much for taking the time to watch. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. If not, then you know what? It's alright. We'll still be pals. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Until then, please stay safe out there. Tell someone that you love them. And remember, above all else, keep smiling.